this was a program as we were planning our webinar series that it essentially kind of combines some of the greatest hits from some of our deep dives into the various topics that we're going to be covering today. These are the citations that Dan and Ham and I and the rest of the attorneys that on our team regularly see, right, time and time again. These are our top 5, top 10 citations by just in terms of the number of violations issued, but also the penalty amount. So these are things that I think the way I often look at it is you may think that your programs are in good shape, but we see time and time again with even some really sophisticated, high functioning safety programs that certain things get missed. These are the things that if you kind of learn from all the experience that we have managing, many inspections and citation cases over the years, where we see holes and gaps that are backed up by the stats. So without further ado, just real brief introductions. I'm Aaron Gelb, a partner with the firm. I'm based in Chicago. I'll let Dan and Hema, you want to just briefly introduce yourselves, and then we'll get rolling.
Sure. I'm Dan Deacon. I'm a partner based out of our DC office. Hema?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hema Steele, based in Ohio, and I joined CMC about a year ago, and before that spent over a decade with the solicitor's office representing OSHA in the Department of Labor.
Great. And so the topics that we're going to be covering today, we're going to start with hazard communication, Haz Com. Then we're going to dive into the control of hazardous energy, also known as Lockout. Brief review of some of the main machine guarding violations that we see. Then we'll cover power industrial trucks and respiratory protection. So bit of a grab bag, but again, lots of typical and citations that we see time and time again. So without further ado, Hema, I'll hand it off to you, shut my camera off, and we'll get rolling.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. So we're going to start easy this afternoon. Like Aaron said, we have a lot to get through, and luckily we're going to start with an easy one, which is Haz Com. It's very straightforward. Up here, I'm not going to read through this, but I assume most of you have some familiarity with Haz Com, or hazard communication standards, which essentially it kind of breaks up into two large parties, I guess. There are requirements for manufacturers and importers of chemicals, and then sometimes overlapping requirements for employers who have those chemicals in their workplaces. But fundamentally, you got to have your chemicals labeled so that employees know what it is and what kinds of hazards are associated with that chemical. They need to be labeled, and that information about the chemical has to be easy to access. So with that, let's talk about some of the most commonly cited Haz Com substandards in the last couple of years. You got them listed right here. The Haz Com standard, this 1910.1200, accounted for more than 10% of all general industry citations that were issued back in 2023. We don't have the data yet for 2024, but we can trust that OSHA is going to keep continuing to focus on Haz Com. And you can see there I have on the slide, this is low-hanging fruit. And the reason I say that is what you're going to hear from Dan and Aaron later today, we're talking about very complex they'll be talking about complex standards, respiratory protection, powered industrial vehicles, and the like. Haz Com, yes, the chemistry side of it is complicated, but for most employers, what they need to do and tell their employees is actually quite simple. And so, it's easy for OSHA to cite, and perhaps easy for employers to miss some of these issues. So we're going to talk about some of those today. A couple of quick notes about Haz Com standards generally. If you as an employer don't have any kind of a Haz Com program, that's where you can get into a lot of trouble, because the OSHA directive allows area directors to separately cite every single missing part of your program. And those are going to be these different items that we're actually going to talk about today: labeling, training, safety data sheets, and the like. So make sure you have something and make sure you keep it updated. And also another note, for those of you who are on multi-employer sites, that's work sites where you have more than one employer working in that space, be really mindful. Even if your own employees don't use hazardous chemicals, but another employer at that site is using chemicals and is exposing your employees, you have to have your own Haz Com program. So please be mindful of that. So let's start now talking about 1200 E1, which is the most common Haz Com violation that OSHA cites. Over 700 times in 2023 it was cited with nearly $4 million in penalties. The most basic thing, E1, is failure to have that written program I mentioned earlier. And it's rarely contested because either you have a program or you don't. I think it's pretty rare for an employer to have something in the gray area. So if you don't have it, you're going to get cited for it. And keep in mind, it's very, very common that COSHOs or compliance officers, when they open their inspection, one of the first things they will ask for, in addition to the OSHA 300 logs, is going to be the Haz Com program. In particular, if the compliance officer has reason to think there might be some sort of written program deficiencies at your work site or with your company. So that's, I think, in my view, that's a reason it's often cited, because right off the bat, they ask for it. And if you can't give it to them, boom, right there, you put yourself in danger of getting a citation. So, like we say there at the bottom, have a program, just make sure it's current. You want to make sure that you got the program that describes how you're going to label, how you're going to provide your safety data sheets, the list of all the chemicals that you're using, and how you intend to train your employees on your program. So let's move on to the next most commonly cited Haz Com standard, which is 1200H1. That's failure to train your employees and to give them enough information about the Haz Com program, as well as the chemicals that are being used at your work site. As you can see there, it's cited, it was cited almost 850 times, over $1 million in proposed penalties in 2023. Fundamentally, if there are hazardous chemicals in the workplace, you got to make sure your employees know what the chemicals are, what hazard they pose, how they can protect themselves, and where they would go to get more information. An important thing that I think employers tend to miss is that when there are new chemical-related hazards at the work site, your employees need to be trained on them. And it's easy to make a mistake and train your employees on new chemicals, which you can do. Every time you add a new chemical to your work site, you can train them on the chemical. But if that new chemical has the same type of hazard, let's say of flammability as a previously existing chemical, you don't necessarily need to retrain on that, because your employees have now been taught about how to handle flammable chemicals. But if instead your new chemical is, let's say, a corrosive material, and they've never worked with a corrosive material before or have never been trained on it, then you need to make sure you're training them on that new chemical hazard. This violation is contested a little bit more often because it's easy for there to be some confusion about whether or not the employees receive training. Certainly, if you don't have your paperwork documenting the training, that's an easy way to get a citation. But another common thing that I think employers tend to miss is that employees might not necessarily know Haz Com. They might not know the phrase Haz Com. They might not understand the phrase hazardous communication. Even if you have trained them on chemicals and the dangers of chemicals and where to find information about them, if the compliance officer is asking your employees, hey, were you trained on Haz Com? And they say, I don't know what that is, or no, I haven't been trained on it, because they don't know that terminology, that's another easy place for a slip up for employers. Now, of course, if that indeed turns out to be the case and you get cited for it, after the fact, you can provide the paperwork and documentation to OSHA. But of course, as we all know, that's time and money that could be better spent in other ways. So it's better to head that off early. So let's move on now to another common Haz Com topic that's cited by OSHA often. I kind of grouped these together, 1200 G1 and G8. Those are related to providing safety data sheets. Cited over 600 times, more than $600,000 in penalties, and the requirements are very similar. As I said at the outset, the 1200 standards have slightly different requirements for manufacturers and importers versus employers. So under these two standards, it's essentially telling companies that if you manufacture and import, you need to be obtaining or developing those data sheets, or if you're an employer, that you have to maintain those data sheets in your workplace. And the key thing to remember here that's very, very important is that these data sheets must be readily accessible. It is not enough to have a dusty, torn up copy in a binder at headquarters or in a cupboard in a break room. It has to be a data sheet that is accessible while the employee is in their workspace. And similarly, I know a lot of companies nowadays are switching to electronic access, and that's okay too, as long as they have immediate access. They don't have to go all the way across the plant floor to a computer terminal to get access to that data sheet. And this makes sense, of course. I think it's can be kind of frustrating for employers to make sure that these data sheets are available. But really what OSHA is trying to prevent happening is having employees cut corners and saying, oh, I'm not going to walk, 3/4 of a mile to go look it up. I'm just going to make an assumption about how to use this or the safe way to use it. So make sure those data sheets are readily accessible to your employees. Next, let's talk about labeling of containers, 1200 F62. This one I find very interesting. Not cited quite as often as some of the others I just mentioned. You can see here the penalties were lower, not as, we didn't have any willful violations in 2023. But it's interesting because it's very specific. 1200 F6 just broadly says you have to label your containers. F61, here we can see it requires very specific pieces of information beyond the container, the name of the chemical, the signal words, the hazard statements, and so on. But then 1200 F62 allows for an alternative approach to labeling. And it says that you can include any combination of words, pictures, or symbols about the hazards of the chemical, as long as all the other information that the employee needs to know is immediately available to them. That's considered an alternative labeling system. So what that's telling us is that, by OSHA often citing this, what that's telling us is that employers maybe think they are doing this alternative approach under 1200 F62, but they're not putting enough information on the container. Either they only have the chemical name and therefore nothing about the hazards, or that information that's not on the label that is supposed to be immediately available to the employee is not immediately available. And then I just, on a slight tangent that I do want to make sure that you all are aware of when it comes to labeling. I've seen this quite a bit in my brief time here at CMC, where OSHA cites under 1200 F62 or F61. You want to make sure that OSHA knows what's in those containers. If they come across an empty container and then turn around and hit you with a citation for unlabeled containers of hazardous materials, do they know it's a hazardous material? How do they know, do they know is it water? Is it bleach? Is it something, corrosive, whatnot? So can they prove, are they getting enough information from you to be able to say, yes, that was a hazardous chemical in the container? So kind of keep an eye out for what kind of information they're gathering to establish whether that's a hazardous chemical in there. And then also relatedly, an issue that I've seen happen a lot as well is that both the employer and OSHA assume that if it's X chemical and that chemical is known to generally be hazardous, they just go with it. OSHA cites it as a violation under 1200 and the employer doesn't think twice. But you got to look at those safety data sheets closely, because a lot of times the dilution levels affect the hazardous nature of the chemical. So it could be that, yes, at full strength, that chemical is hazardous, but if it's in a container and it is diluted to a certain dilution level, it's no longer hazardous, and therefore this 1200 F6 little 2 violation does not necessarily stick. So I'm going to leave it at that. I know that was very, very fast, but like I said, you guys have some meatier information coming to you from Aaron and Dan. So I think Aaron, you're up next.
Thanks, Emma. And I think that is exactly the cadence that we're looking for. I think when we envision this, it's a little bit of a lightning round, kind of a, if I'm gonna run out on the shop floor, or go through the facility looking for some of the most frequently cited, but also most expensive violations. That's a really good summary of Haz Com and what we see most often. And I think one of those last points that you made is a really important one, as far as where's the hazard, right? Like there are quite a few compliance officers that cite, just like Hema said, oh, there's an unlabeled container and there's something in it, and so therefore that's a violation of the standard. But they don't go those extra steps of either taking a sample, confirming what's in there, even if an employee says that that's what I think is in there, can they ultimately prove that? And that's going to be a theme through a lot of things that we talk about both today and generally, of really trying to push back and determine is there actually proof of a hazard. As far as lockout, tagout, so I present quite often on lockout, tagout, being here in the Midwest and a lot with tons of manufacturing, including pretty close to my home in the city and beyond. I deal with the standard all the time and see lots and lots of these violations on a regular basis. So I've tried to distill down the next series of slides again to give you the tools to and the questions to ask. So we're not going to be solving every deep contemplative issue about lockout, tagout. I really want to highlight the issues that we see time and time again. Again, just you might have a facility out there that oh, I'm sure they're fine, but maybe these are the issues to take a look at and to double check. So in terms of which sections of 1910-147 are cited most frequently, I'm sure many of you know this. The going away winner is C4 for either not having machine specific energy control procedures or deficiencies in the procedures, right? So that's that double whammy is A, you have to have them, and B, they have to be correct. And occasionally OSHA will also cite either as an alternative or in addition to a 147D violation, because C4 requires you to have them and to utilize them. So sometimes if OSHA determines that there is a pervasive failure to follow a procedure, they'll cite that under C4. Second, C6 periodic inspections. For our longtime fans, you probably know we've done an entire webinar just on periodic inspections. It may not be the most cited section of the standard, but I think it's the most misunderstood section of 147. Then C1, not having a program, similar to what Hema talked about with respect to Haz Com, right? To me, that's a very different type of violation, and usually that's smaller employers, ones that don't generally have a dedicated safety person. They don't even know that they need a lockout program. So we're not really going to dive into that one. Because if you don't have a program, you're going to need a lot of work, and we're not going to solve that in today's webinar. Fourth, lockout tagout training. So, but that encompasses both authorized employees, affected employees, as well as others. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then last but not least, the application or the actual use of lockout. So with respect to your machine specific procedures, right, from OSHA's standpoint, and I've been, I've had conversations with, past heads of enforcement, as well as individuals who were involved in writing the LOTO directive, the CPL. The prevailing view at the agency, I think probably many safety professionals, is that good and effective, accurate lockout, tagout, machine-specific procedures are the heart of an effective lockout program. If your procedures are accurate, right, that means people are able to, presumably you have identified the hazardous energy sources that are present. You've determined how to control them. And if they're accurate, that probably means you're doing your periodic inspections and doing them correctly. You're training people on how to use these procedures. So when OSHA comes in and does an inspection and your procedures are simply either they're majorly lacking in a number of areas, or they have certain key issues that keep showing up across various procedures, they're going to grow increasingly concerned with every deficiency or flaw they find in your procedures. So what does a good procedure need to have? It's got to have a specific statement of what the procedure is used for, right? So some of our clients, they say in food manufacturing, you may have one lockout procedure that you use for sanitation and a different that you use for maintenance. So if that's the case, right, then you should have a specific statement in that procedure, what it is used for, perhaps what it's not used for. Then you need detailed steps for how to shut down, isolate, block, or secure the energy sources to which people might be exposed when they're using the procedure. Identify the specific steps for the placement and removal of blocks, and then include specific requirements to test or verify that you've reached either a zero energy state or that you've effectively controlled the hazardous energy sources, right? Certain types of energy will never reach a zero energy state. So the key that, if you see the theme that runs through this, right, it's detailed and specific. And I would say one of the most common mistakes or flaws that I see are procedures that lack that detail, lack that sufficiency. Oftentimes folks that may purchase procedures through one of the companies that offer to provide them for you. And I can't tell you how many times those procedures are not, they don't meet the moment. They are not sufficient to comply with the standard, despite what is represented to you by the company that sold them to you and sold you that service. So it's discouraging to me that that happens so much. So really, if you're going to go back out and assess your procedures, really look to see if they are sufficiently specific and detailed, such that someone could just pick it up and carry out that procedure. So some of the questions I like to ask is, again, who wrote them? I've seen plenty of clients that, the person who wrote them isn't a machine expert, that they don't have really great knowledge of how the machine works, what the energy sources are. It's not required that you perform an assessment of a hazard assessment of the machine. At least you can't necessarily be cited for that like you can under the PPE standard. But you really need to do a full-blown assessment of the machine to identify the hazards and make sure the person who's writing them understands those things. Is the procedure written in a way that your employees can understand them? You're going to hear the same question about your training materials. I just covered this in the last slide. Again, make sure that each step is covered. I often see procedures that miss a step. Or again, lack sufficient detail. If you use photographs, make sure that they're accurate. I've had clients cited when the photograph that shows where the disconnect is located is either the wrong location. It shows a disconnect that is a different color. Sometimes there are multiple levers or switches or what have you in an area, and perhaps that photograph is wrong. There's still some question, again, as both him and I have said, there may not be an actual hazard. The compliance officer may think there's the potential for confusion, but if all of your employees testify that there isn't, I'd certainly argue there is no hazard. But if you use photographs, make sure they're accurate. If you've made changes, just like Kama talked about, if you've introduced a new chemical, right? If you modified a piece of equipment, if you've changed the configuration, the layout of that machine, how it functions, again, make sure that you update your procedure and then make sure you retrain people on the changes to the procedure. I know this next one may seem really elemental and basic, but make sure that all the hazardous energy sources are identified. We talk in our more detailed lockout specific presentations about those forgotten energy sources: gravity, heat, cold, capacitors that have stored electricity, different types of energy sources that are often missed or not appropriately addressed in the procedure. With respect to verification, I would say from my own experience that the most common mistake or flaw in a procedure that I've seen is failure to sufficiently detail how to verify that the procedure has worked. I often see simply a statement, verify, the energy is controlled or something like that. And that is almost always not going to be enough. If particularly energy sources like pneumatic or hydraulic, if there is a valve or a gauge, sorry, apologies, if there's a gauge and it needs to be at 0 PSI, the procedure should say, check the gauge at this location to make sure that it says 0 PSI or whatever the required reading is. Now, here's again, not necessarily a hazard, but I've often gotten feedback from compliance officers where a procedure addresses energy sources that are not hazardous. And then that means that it is disregarded or ignored by your employees, which can set up a dangerous precedent if people believe that they know more about the procedures and the hazards, and so they think that they're able to ignore a step in a procedure. If you have uncommon or unusual steps, so perhaps only 1 or 2 pieces of equipment that require something like a block to prevent gravity or the movement of the equipment, make sure that it's adequately explained. Again, there's sufficient detail to describe how to apply that protective measure. Think about if you have machines that are interconnected or related, that potential energy sources are addressed as well. And then from a practical standpoint, and tied also to Hema's comment about your safety data sheets, if they're not accessible, same thing with your procedures. Most folks put them on or right next to the machine. Sometimes they'll be in a binder in a particular room or corner of the facility. But I've been to facilities where all the lockout procedures are in a binder in the cafeteria. What's the likelihood that if somebody has a question or is not sure that they're going to, particularly, they got to take off their PPE, or they have to clean, wash, change, put in a gown, or put on a hairnet or whatever it is, that they're going to walk all the way instead of just wing it. And what that means for an inspection is the compliance officer is likely going to then start digging into questions with the operators about whether they actually ever look at those procedures and then whether they understand them. Speaking of understanding, so training your authorized employees, right? So I will often ask, who are you training and what do they do? Again, the level of training, depending on the complexity of your equipment and your procedures, the duties of the authorized employee, their responsibilities under the procedure. They have to understand the basics of your program, why you have it, how it works. They need to be able to recognize and understand both the type and magnitude of the energy sources that they may be exposed to, how you control those energy sources or how they are authorized to control them. And then any information about the equipment that they are going to be servicing or maintaining that is relevant to their use of those procedures, right? The last thing I mean, from a purely safety standpoint, right? If we are requiring people to perform tasks that expose them to energy sources that could cause amputations or could kill them, they need to understand these things, and the compliance officers are going to be asking them questions to test whether they understand these things. And that's why I think that the point also about, maybe they don't know the word Haz Com, but they know chemical safety. Same thing here. Maybe I've had people that they don't know what an authorized employee is because the company uses a different term, right? So a lot of times when we're getting people ready for inspection interviews, we want to make sure that they at least understand the terminology that's being used, but people need to understand what it means to be authorized, and how to use the procedures, how to protect themselves. As far as obviously what I would call awareness training for your affected and other employees, a lot more basic. I would say usually training of authorized employees, again, depending on the type of work they perform, could be anywhere from an hour and a half to 3 hours to a day or two. Affected employees, it's usually a handful of slides, as long as they understand, again, that you have a hazardous energy control program and the procedures, so they can recognize when those procedures are being used, and that they understand, not to attempt to restart a locked out machine. Pretty basic stuff. I think most of our clients go beyond the very, very minimal requirements, but that is, if you're looking at least the bare minimum of what you need to do, obviously, so they don't put themselves in harm's way when servicing or maintenance is going on, and so they don't do something that could lead to an accident involving the people who are doing the work. When you're assessing your training materials, questions I typically ask when I'm on site with a client or if I'm going through their program, is your training site specific? Right. I think that is to me essentially non-negotiable. If you're not training people on the equipment that is actually in their facility, if your program doesn't have, or the training materials don't have photographs of the type of equipment that they're going to be using, the types of devices and hardware they're going to be using to lock out the energy sources, there's a good chance it's not going to be effective. I know a lot of people on a related question is the training live? Is it, is there an instructor? Is there hands-on training? I get some pushback from this, but I certainly advise, if you're simply relying on a video to train your authorized employees, there's a good chance, you may survive quite a few inspections with certain compliance officers that are just checking the box and they're going through their list of questions, and you give them a training roster and they're like, fine, that's it. But I can almost guarantee if you have a serious accident, fatality, amputation, hospitalization, where someone is seriously injured, they're going to be diving in a lot deeper, and they're going to be looking for understanding and comprehension. And to be clear, right, again, you do that not for compliance reasons, you do that to make sure that your employees are safe. You want to make sure that they understand what they're doing, if they're going to be risking their limbs and their lives. So the training really has to be effective. I don't think I've yet seen a out of the box video that's going to be effective for an authorized employee, certainly someone who is in maintenance and carrying out multiple procedures, dealing with various types of energy sources. If you have temps, and I know a lot of folks don't authorize their temps, but if you do authorize your temps, make sure they get the same training or equivalent training as your people. I certainly would not rely on my 8 staffing agency to train them. They may provide some general, energy control concepts in a general training to them, but you should be providing them your training when they're on site with you. Make sure they're trained in a language that they understand and in a method that they understand, right? If you have employees who don't have a high school degree, that training should be different than if you have, highly degreed engineers who are locking on equipment. How bad is your turnover? A lot of times we're out of COVID, right? I think OSHA's certainly forgotten about COVID. They're not asking questions about COVID cases on your logs anymore, but I'm still seeing the effects of COVID in terms of companies that have had a lot of turnover. That perhaps their lockout program wasn't as vigorously updated when the safety folks were focusing on COVID. And if you've had a lot of turnover and you had a really good program in 2019, are you back up to where you were before? But even that aside, if you have a lot of turnover and people are regularly joining and as authorized employees, there may not be that history of knowledge and training. So you need to think about that as far as when you're assessing your training program. If your supervisors have the authority to reassign people from one area to another, you should have some check on that ability to make sure that before somebody performs a new task, if it involves the control of hazardous energy, that they are aware of and have been sufficiently trained to do that work. And then last but not least, this is a question that I've asked after a number of years of people who are trained specifically not to do something and do it and then suffer terrible consequences, including death. And the takeaway that I've reached is, I think sometimes you tell them what to do or what not to do, but maybe there's not enough information as to the why, right? What is the hazard that's inside that machine? What could happen to them? So think about that when you're assessing your program or your training program, and really ask, do people understand why what is the hazard? What could happen to them if they don't lock out the pneumatic energy or the hydraulic energy or put the safety block on? All right, periodic inspections. Again, as I said earlier, I think this is the most misunderstood section of the standard. There are 3 steps that you need to complete when you're doing a periodic inspection. So you need to have an inspector who is an authorized employee observing a representative sample of authorized employees who are performing or carrying out the machine specific procedure. They do not have to observe every authorized employee, obviously carrying out every single procedure. I would say this is perhaps the most, I don't want to say misunderstood, but certainly the most difficult to comply with, but also very unclear guidance. It's something that, if OSHA goes ahead and updates the lockout standard, I would very much like to see greater clarity here. I've talked to folks involved in drafting the CPL, and the takeaway is generally, representative can usually be 20% or so. Maybe that's not always feasible, but that's a good objective, I'm told. But the problem is, I've never really gotten a clear answer from current OSHA folks on the enforcement side as what is sufficient. But ultimately, I think as long as you can show that the procedure is being evaluated and that every employee is participating in at least one periodic inspection, I think you stand a better chance of not getting cited. Second, the inspector must, and this is where I think most folks miss the boat, is that the inspector must then review the procedure with each authorized employee of their responsibilities under the procedure. So that essentially captures everybody who's not observed actually carrying it out. You know, this is a performance-oriented standard, meaning it's up to you to decide how to comply with it. I think what a lot of folks do is, you know, they observe, they have the authorized person observe the other authorized person, a representative sample, a couple of folks maybe carrying it out, and then they gather the rest of the team, they observe it, and they're given an opportunity to ask questions or make comments. But then make sure the third step that when you prepare a certification that you've completed the periodic inspection, you got to list what piece of equipment was reviewed, the date, the employee who was doing the observation, the employee who was carrying out the procedure, but then capture, you know, have a section at the bottom to have everybody else with whom it was reviewed also record their names. So again, if you've got two people, one observer, one person carrying it out, and then 10 other employees watching it and observing, so you're reviewing the procedure with those other 10, make sure their names are all captured as well. So hopefully you've got everybody, when you gather all your periodic inspection forms, you're going to have multiple people who are being observed, and you're going to have everybody participating in a review. Ideally, you'll have people who, you know, were observed carrying out one procedure and were participating in the review of the other procedures. The point of the periodic inspection, make sure that the steps are being followed, that the employees who are likely to carry out the procedure understand their responsibilities under the procedure, and also whether the procedure provides the necessary protection and whether any changes are needed. So essentially what that boils down to is, do people know how to carry out the procedure? And when they do, does the procedure actually work? So some folks don't actually lock out the equipment when they're doing a periodic inspection. I've had folks use dummy boards, right? OSHA is going to cite you if you don't actually lock out the piece of equipment, because you need to verify that the procedure actually controls the energy sources that are possibly present. Make sure you do the periodic inspections. You know, it's an annual requirement, and that means every 12 months. It does not mean every calendar year. If you have a procedure that's used less than once a year, you only need to inspect it before it's used. You don't need to do a periodic inspection of that procedure every year. It's for some of the questions to ask, you know, how do you have a plan when you're of how you're going to accomplish and comply with this section of the standard? Some folks do it through a series of random audits, and they track the procedures, and they make sure by the end of that 12-month period for each procedure that those audits are done. Others will do it through, you know, intentional planned observations. Others kind of some combination of tours, random audits, planned observations. Whatever you do, you just want to be tracking these to make sure you don't find yourself at the end of the year, you know, with hundreds and hundreds of procedures to audit. And then last but not least, the minor servicing exception, another requirement that is often misunderstood and misapplied. So the elements, and I'm sure most of our listeners know these, is that the task has to be performed during normal operations. It needs to be necessary to the production process. It has to be routine, repetitive, and integral to production. And the worker has to be protected by effective alternative measures. I've had folks from OSHA question witnesses in inspections that I've managed where they say equally effective to lockout. Well, that is not the requirement. It has to be effective. It doesn't have to be equal to lockout, or, you know, the way I argued it is that would mean it is lockout. And in that case, you know, I'm going to interrupt the compliance officer as asking that question, because I don't want them to confuse my witness. But that is the requirement. It needs to be effective alternative protection. So what does it mean to be routine, repetitive, and integral to production? In terms of routine, right? I think routine is what it means. Something that's routine is not, I would say it's not a big deal. It is to use an example for one of my food manufacturing clients, they have trays that go down a production line, and food product is deposited into these trays. Occasionally a tray will get out of line. They have an interlocked gate or hole in the line. They open it up. They use a tool to pop that tray back into line, close the gate. It's a control reliable gate. It stops the line. They close it. They restart it. It resumes. That's routine. When they have a massive tray pileup, just like a multi-car accident on the interstate, that's not routine, right? So they will lock it out before trying to clear 20 or 30 trays that are jammed up on top of each other. Repetitive, again, not clearly defined, but one, I would say certainly something that happens, at least a few times a week. Some folks may require it to happen more often than not. I pair routine and repetitive together, right? The more frequently it happens and the more routine it is, the concept behind it is, look, we see this all the time. It's not a big deal. And we just need to do this to keep the production process going. That's likely to pass muster because it's not a major malfunction in the system. It's not something that rarely happens. So the idea behind that is if it happens all the time and it's not a major issue, it's more likely to be safe to proceed with this work without exposing that employee to a hazard, provided, again, there are those effective alternative measures. And there are lots of different things that can be determined to be effective. It could be the use of certain tools, remote devices. I talked just a second ago about interlocks. You got to make sure if you are relying on interlocks that they are the right type, that they are installed correctly, and they are the monitoring system. Is not if it can monitor 8 interlocks, that there are only 8 that are wired into it. It could be the use of local disconnects or control switches that are under exclusive control. If you're going to rely on alternative protection or use minor servicing, my advice certainly is to document both the reasoning why you believe it's necessary, as well as the steps taken to determine if those measures are effective. And then just real quickly, if you use interlocks, do you have the manual? Have you evaluated the electrical specs for that safety system? Have you documented your hazard assessment used to create the procedure? Is it written? I like to see it posted at the workstation, just like the machine specific procedures. I think it's a great idea to train employees on the use and then audit to make sure that they're using it only for those tasks and not going beyond. And then real briefly, if you're going to do 5 things to audit your lockout program, audit your periodic inspections, pull your program out, review it, make sure it reflects the realities on the shop floor, update it as necessary, put 2025 on it, take a look at your training materials, ask those questions that I posed earlier, pressure test your lockout procedures by pulling out 3 of your more complicated ones, going up to the folks that use them and have them walk you through it. And you do that, you're doing a periodic inspection too, and you knocked one off your list. And then perhaps most importantly, have a documented compliance auditing program where you go out and you regularly observe people using lockout, you document it, and you confirm that people are following the rules, and then you've got some great defenses if OSHA comes calling and tries to find fault with your program. So as far as machine guarding, then just really briefly, because I want to hand it off to Dan, very different, right? There are a number of standards to focus on depending on the types of equipment. In terms of the number of citations, we're talking with respect to 212A1, which is just basically general guarding principles, cited over 1,000 times in 2023. The more specific requirement under 212A3II to guard the point of operation, which was cited just over 350 times. If you have equipment that has the potential to move, make sure it's anchored for 212B, about 60 violations. Another very commonly cited one, 215B9 for exposure to abrasive wheels, and then dealt with quite a few under 219. So C4, rotating shaft ends, cited I think about 60 or so times. Pulleys or belts that are less than 7 feet off the ground, and then sprockets and chains under 219 F3, cited over 125 times. My takeaway with respect to guarding is one of the most, just like I talk about auditing for lockout, I think regular floor walks to make sure that your guards that are in place, that they are in good shape, that they've not been removed or tampered with, that you don't have somebody who's taped something over or bypassed a guard with some sort of magnet or something like that. But also just regularly watching your employees, how they interact with the equipment, look for ways, if you get a gotcha stick that you can use to measure the distance from an opening to the point of operation, because the odds are that I don't think I've ever seen a plant audit that didn't come back with multiple guarding opportunities. And if there's a serious incident or injury, OSHA is going to find those. And if you've got a history of them, they're going to cite it as a repeat. So with that, Dan, I will hand it off to you.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. All right, we're going to dive right into the powered industrial truck issues here. So when we think of some of the key topics and things that OSHA focuses on a granular level, pit operations are one of those topics, right? It's something that if you have powered industrial trucks in your workplace and OSHA walks in the door, they're going to be looking into it. And why is that important? You see here on the screen all of the data from fiscal year 2023, over 2,500 citations issued under the PIT standard, a number of those willful and repeat, and quite a significant amount of fines, 13.5 million throughout the calendar year there. It amounts to about 4% of all citations issued by OSHA throughout the year. So there's several key components to a successful PIT program, right? But the big ones are what you see on the right-hand side of the screen here. It's training, identification and repair of defects or any safety issues with a forklift, modifications and attachments, data plates and load capacities, and of course, safe operations and employee operators. So we're going to show you over the next few slides here just where those risks lie and provide some tips on how to make sure you have a robust PIT program, help you prevent incidents, and also mitigate the risk of an enforcement action. So on the next slide, we're going to start with the most commonly cited PIT violation, and that's training. About 1,484 PIT training violations. That's about 58% of all citations issued under 1910-178. So when we talk about training in your training program, it needs to consist of three key components, and that's classroom training, hands-on training and a practical demonstration, and then finally the trainer evaluation of the operator to ensure they're competent and certified to operate that forklift or powered industrial truck in your workplace. As far as the content is concerned, the regulations spell out a number of different truck-related and workplace-related topics. And those are in 1910-178 L3. And there's numerous different subsections in there of safe operations, work-specific conditions that you need to review. One thing that is really important to keep in mind is operators need to be trained on different types of forklifts that they may be operating in the workplace. So it's not, if you have 4 different models, or 4 different types of forklifts that an operator may be using, you can't just train on one of them and say, all right, well, I've trained them on forklifts. You need to train them on each one of those specific types of pits. Retraining, this is another thing that comes up often. There's 4 key indicators in which retraining is required. And that's when an operator has been observed to operate the vehicle in an unsafe manner. So this gets back to your auditing, and Aaron was talking about a lot of this in the lockout tagout context, right? In the PIT context, it's equally, if not more important as well, because you have operators that are operating very heavy pieces of equipment that can cause significant damage to both property, but also coworkers and employees in the workplace, right? So as part of your PIT program, we have the policies themselves, the training, all of that, but the auditing and ensuring that employees are following those rules and the training that they've received is so important. And OSHA wants to see that program is effective in practice. Everything that you have in writing in your training, it only goes so far. If it's not being implemented and effective in practice, that's where you can run into trouble. Retraining also needs to be provided when there's an incident or a near miss, anytime the operator is assigned to drive a different type of forklift, and anytime there's a condition in the workplace that may change the manner that could affect the safe operation of the truck. And the evaluation piece, you need to conduct the evaluations of each powered industrial truck operator, evaluate their performance at least once every 3 years. That's the baseline. Best practice, you should be doing it more often. Of course, if you're doing these auditing, the auditing of these operators and you're documenting those, you can use those as well. There's certain certification and documentation requirements that go into that. And that's on the next slide here. So the certification piece, that's that final element of the PIT training. It's really important to have, right? Because one, it's required by the standard, but also two, kind of the old motto goes with OSHA, right? Well, if you don't have it written down, you're not doing it, right? So the easy way to show that, okay, we're complying with the standard and all the training requirements, and we've completed the classroom, the practical demonstration and this evaluation, is having that piece of paper, that certification, that's saying the operator has been trained and evaluated in accordance with those standards. So it needs to include the name of the operator, the training date, the evaluation date, and the name of the person performing that training evaluation. So on the next slide, we're just going to look at some of the most frequently cited training violations. And this is all under 178L. So L1I, this is related to general standard to ensure operators are competent to operate the pit. With this violation, you're likely going to get some additional citations, perhaps for failing to do the evaluation, or a paperwork issue for failing to have the certification. 178L1II, permitting employees to operate pits with ensuring that the training has been completed. 178L6, again, the certification paperwork issues. L4 III, failure to conduct the evaluation of each pit operator's performance at least every 3 years. And then L2II is the training content piece. So these are kind of the high ticket items under the training violation. And you can see here, it compiles quite a bit of those 1,499 violations under the PIT standard, or the PIT's training standard, I should say. So the next slide, we're going to talk about repairs and defects, another one of the most frequently cited standards in the PIT rules. So when it comes to repairs and defects, this is one area that we've seen kind of an increased focus on. The key requirement here is to remember that forklifts need to be inspected prior to being placed into service at each shift. So a lot of employers and our clients utilize an electronic checklist of some sort these days, where the operator, when they check out the forklift itself at the beginning of their shift, they're completing that. That's one way to ensure the requirements being taken care of. You can also do paper records, but the key here is to make sure that you're documenting the inspections of these lifts prior to beginning each shift. Now, a lot of employers come to us and say, okay, well, we're doing an inspection at the beginning of the day and operate those pits, till the end of the day, no matter who's operating it. Well, that's not really permissible under the standard. There needs to be an inspection of that pit at the change of each shift. So if a new operator is coming to relieve someone, and at changing a shift, they need to be doing their own pre-shift inspection before beginning operations on that pit. It's somewhat of an administrative burden, right? But it is required, and it doesn't take a lot of time. There's no per se requirement that it be done or documented, I should say. But again, the old motto, if you don't have it documented, you didn't do it, and you don't want to be fighting that uphill battle. So we do have a lot of clients and employers that have transitioned into making sure that those are done. It's hard to audit and make sure that employees are doing it if you don't have that documentation piece. And certainly if there's an incident related to a defect and you don't have that documentation or paperwork, and an employee doesn't remember doing it, or they say they didn't do it, that becomes a big problem for you. continuing with repairs and defects, it accounts for 16% of all pit citations. Failure to take the pit out of service that has a defect or repair, failing to have those repairs done by authorized personnel, and again, failing to do that pre-shift inspection. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about attachments and additions, and this is something that we see often as well. It's a major source of contention and something that OSHA sometimes gets confused about as well. So a majority of the time, I say almost always, if you have a homemade attachment on a forklift and the data plate isn't updated, or that pit and the attachment hasn't been examined and approved by a manufacturer or a professional engineer, you're likely to get a citation. The standard most often cited, 1910-178A4, states modifications and additions which affect capacity and safe operation shall not be performed by the customer or user without manufacturer's prior written approval. OSHA rarely analyzes whether the attachment does indeed actually affect the capacity and safe operation of the pit. Oftentimes they're looking at it pretty black and white, right? Oh, you have a homemade attachment, you don't have a data plate. Is there an analysis here? No, then we're going to issue the citation. So there are ways to defend those citations, but it does create a bit of a headache for employers more often than not, and it's going to require you to get that attachment analyzed one way or the other. So let's do that from the start and avoid a potential citation altogether. Last slide here on pit operations. The operator violations and safe operations of the pit itself, that accounts for approximately 12% of all pit citations. And that varies from when the operator of an industrial truck is dismounted and within 25 feet, making sure those controls are lowered, neutralized, and the brakes are set to prevent movement. And some of the key ones, slowing down and sounding your horn at cross aisles and obstructed areas, looking in the direction of travel and keeping a clear view, ensuring the load is stable and centered while carrying the load. This all goes back to the training that you're providing, the policies that you have, but also the auditing and making sure that operators are complying with those rules and building that safety culture within your program to make sure that everyone's bought in and buying into compliance and making sure everyone goes home safe, right? So that takes care of the pit overview that we wanted to provide. I know we're running out of a little bit of time here, so I'm going to go through respiratory protection somewhat quick here. Similar to the pit standard, we're looking at approximately 2,500 citations in fiscal year 2023, a number of willful and repeats. And the top 5 or top 6, I should say, most common respiratory protection violations are related to your written programs, medical evaluations, fit testing, the face seal protection and issues with facial hair, training, and another big one, voluntary use. Those account for about 75% of all respiratory protection violations issued per year. The other two big ones, or the other big one I should say, is the training and the seal fit checks that gets into the face seal protection. But we're going to dive into a few of these in some detail here on the next slides. So going on to the next one, again, these are kind of the most frequently cited ones, the big ones, fit testing and medical evaluations. And you see the two on the left-hand side of the screen, 134K6 and 134C2. Those are both related to voluntary use. The failure to provide Appendix D in instances of voluntary use, and some additional steps when you're implementing a voluntary use program. These violations are kind of easy for OSHA to stack, right? For example, if they find that you don't appropriately address respiratory hazards in the workplace and respiratory protection is required, well, if you don't have that written program, right, under 134C1, you're likely getting cited for that, but you may also get the violations for not providing the respirator and the fit testing and the medical evaluations and the training. So we do often see, even in the voluntary use context, if they find a respirator that shouldn't be there, even if you don't know about it. And of course, that is a defense to a citation, right? Knowledge. you might often find yourself in a scenario where you're getting multiple violations for a respirator that you didn't even know was in your workplace. So the kind of key point there is, one, we're talking about an evaluation, an exposure assessment. But on the voluntary use side, if you see someone with a respirator and you have perhaps done the evaluation, you don't need respiratory protection in your workplace, that doesn't mean that you can't do anything, right? You still have an obligation to do something under the standard, under 134C and 134K. So due diligence is important. On the next slide, we're going to talk about, what to look out for, right? Your exposure assessment. And that's really the key to determining what your obligations are under 1910-134. And a lot of issues kind of stem from that exposure assessment and that analysis in the first place, related also to your PPE hazard assessment, right? So again, going back to that due diligence, do you have potential air contaminants, dust, fumes, gases, mists, chemicals, sprays? Do you have an oxygen deficient atmosphere? Do you deal with hazardous drugs? These are things that you need to proactively look at. Look at the SDSs for chemicals in your workplace, conducting air monitoring. You can look at the permissible exposure limits applicable to certain chemicals in Table Z. And finally, you want to evaluate your engineering and administrative controls to eliminate and control airborne contaminants. And that's inherent in the standard itself, 134A1. That instructs employers to use feasible environmental controls to control the hazard before implementing respiratory protection. It's a last line of defense. So if you have engineering and administrative controls that can eliminate the hazard or control it such that you don't need respiratory protection, that is inherent in the requirement of the standard. So again, going back to that due diligence, that is important from the get-go to do that exposure assessment so you can avoid issues and mitigate the risk of enforcement. The respiratory protection program, right? And this is a big one, 134C1, 361 violations in 2023. And this slide is just meant to outline the key components of a respiratory protection program: procedures for selecting the respirators for use in the workplace, medical evaluations and fit testing, procedures for proper use, cleaning, disinfecting, and storing, procedures to ensure adequate air quality, quantity, and flow of breathing air for atmosphere supplying respirators where necessary, training, and then evaluating the effectiveness of the overall program. So those are the key components that you need in your written program and elements that you need to implement themselves. And one other key thing to note on this slide is the appendixes referenced here. The appendixes in the standard are mandatory. So things like the medical evaluation questionnaire and Appendix C, the fit testing procedures, and Appendix A, those are things that you need to follow. A lot of times, those appendixes are overlooked. I would advise and stress that you take a close look at those and make sure that you're complying with those appendices as well. The next slide, we're talking about voluntary use, right? And this is about 15% of all respiratory protection violations. So again, if you see someone with a respirator in their workplace and you don't have a program, you've done the analysis, you don't need respiratory protection, you don't have the ability to just sit back and say, okay, it's fine. You still need to do something under the standard. And this is where C2 comes in, and also case 6. So if there is voluntary use in your workplace and you're going to permit that, that's fine, right? You don't have to. If you do, Appendix D is what you need to provide. What we typically advise, again, is consider obtaining a signed copy, maintaining that in the employee file, perhaps. Oftentimes, employers may post a copy in the workplace where employee notices are as well. But the other key thing here, and this is getting into 134C2II, do not allow employees to voluntarily wear anything but an N95 filtering face piece. Voluntary use of a paper respirator is going to create a lot of problems for you. a lot of additional obligations that are burdensome and a lot more difficult to monitor, right? You see the exception highlighted in C2II there. Employers are not required to include in a written respiratory protection program those employees whose only use of respirators involves the voluntary use of filtering face pieces. If you're allowing voluntary use of anything else, you need to make sure that they're medically fit to use those, make sure that they're cleaning them, storing them, and maintaining them, and that they're fit to use them, right? So those create a lot of additional obligations. You don't necessarily need to have a full-blown respiratory protection program for voluntary use of those, tight-fitting, air-supplying respirators, perhaps. But you need to basically comply with about 70% of what a respiratory protection program requires. So don't put yourself in that position. Just don't allow voluntary use of anything but an N95. All right, and the last slide here is going to be on medical evaluations and fit tests. A little over 1,000 citations issued related to fit testing and medical evaluations. That accounts for about 41% of all violations under 1910-134. So a couple of key things here. If you require respirators or they're necessary, right, and you have to implement a respiratory protection program, you need to provide and conduct a medical evaluation to determine the employee's ability to use the respirator before the employee is fit tested. And here, there's a couple things, right? The standard requires you to utilize the medical professional. Appendix C, mandatory, utilizing that medical evaluation questionnaire. And follow-up evaluations may be required. That's where an employee gives a positive response to any of the questions in Section 2, Part A of Appendix C. I think it's questions 1 through 8, or the initial medical examination demonstrates a need for a follow-up. So this isn't an annual requirement per se, but it is something that you need to be mindful of, making sure that if you're implementing a respiratory protection program or you're requiring respirators to be used for certain tasks, that you're implementing this component as well. The thing that we often see, it kind of ties back again to auditing, right? Where you've done, your corporate safety team has done the analysis, the exposure assessment, respiratory protection is not required, but someone in perhaps the maintenance department, they've transferred from, or they're a new hire from a different employer, and they say, oh, well, I've always used a respirator when doing this type of task. They bring their own in. That is kind of the area where we get into trouble, right? And that's where you find someone that is kind of implementing their own program, so to speak, something that they carried over from a former employer that you might not know about. And they're kind of cascading that down to other employees, right? Facilities maintenance manager says like, oh, we're going to wear respirators when we do this task. You have to wear one. OSHA is going to say, okay, well, you're requiring them to utilize respiratory protection here. Now you need to have a respiratory protection program, including the medical evaluations, including the fit tests. So make sure that your exposure assessment and the determinations and protocols that you've developed out of that are shared, and it's very clear to all employees about what respiratory protection is required, is it voluntary use, and how we're going to implement those. Fit tests, before any employee is required to use a respirator with a negative or positive pressure tight fitting face piece, that's including N95s, the employee needs to be fit tested with the same make, model, style, and size of the respirator they're going to be used. The fit tests need to be administered using a qualitative or quantitative testing protocol. And this is an annual requirement. So you need to make sure that these are done and calendared, and you're tracking it on an annual basis. That can be quite burdensome. A lot of times we're utilizing, a mobile unit coming out, doing employees, throughout a week or so, but it is something that you need to track. And it's an easy one that OSHA finds and issues citations for quite often. So that's the high level overview of the respiratory protection piece. And I think we're done there. Aaron, I can turn it back over to you to wrap us up. But thanks for a great program.
Thanks, Dan and Hema. And I'll try to run through a few questions for anyone who wants to stick around. I won't be able to get to them all, but yeah, again, I think feel free to reach out to any of us or whoever you typically work with at CMC, and we'll definitely be sure to get you the answers that you're looking for. A few quick housekeeping notes. Obviously, you're listening to this webinar either live or recorded, so you're probably aware of the other webinars that are scheduled for the remainder of the year. Up next in April, just in time for the warm weather, although some of you may already be experiencing it. Not those of you in Chicago with me, where we've got a couple inches of snow on the ground this morning. But in other parts of the country, I'm going to guess you're already warm. There's lots going on in various states right now. New Mexico is potentially promulgating a heat illness rule. Various states are looking at regulations. So we've got a great team of experts led by Rachel Kahn, who will be presenting next month on heat, and then we've got you covered for the rest of the year. We have some in-person events that are coming up as well. We've got our big Cal OSHA, I think our third annual Cal OSHA and California Employment Law Summit, October 21st in Berkeley, October 23rd in Pasadena. We're going to be partnering on an in-person event with the Illinois Manufacturers Association, June 3rd. And those are, I think, the only in-person events that we've got planned. We've also, you may know, offer a series of special services, master classes on record keeping, on workplace violence in California, as well as California harassment training. We also have an OSHA inspection master class, and we're working on a lockout tagout master class as well. Check out our blogs, and then, like I said, if anyone wants, I'll try to stick around and answer your questions. I saw one question about electronic access to safety data sheets. Somebody says that they were told that that's not sufficient. There is ample documentation on OSHA's website in the form of letters of interpretation that confirm that it is okay to rely on electronic access. The key is to have some sort of backup system, maybe telephone, where you provide the information by telephone, or backup power, or what have you. Whatever it is, again, performance-oriented standard. It's up to you to determine how to have backup access available. But it is okay to have electronic access. Of course, if you're relying on electronic access, make sure it's not a password protected. It's not on a computer in a locked room or in the supervisor's office, etc. Who has to have a lockout program? If your employees are performing servicing and maintenance on your equipment, you need to have a lockout program, unless there are very limited exceptions. If you're only doing, there may be certain very limited exceptions, or at least exceptions to certain requirements with respect to whether you need a procedure, whether if it's just cord and plug, things like that, which would be more detailed than we're going to get into today. But generally, if your employees are potentially exposed to hazardous energy, you need a program. Is probably the most basic level to look at that. There is a question about the single source exception. So there is an exception if there's a piece of machinery that only has one energy source, that you may not necessarily have to have a procedure, but there are, I think, 8 or 9 elements to that exception. One of which is that you not have had an accident involving that piece of equipment. I believe another one is that there cannot be stored energy, right? So if you control that one source of energy, there can't be stored energy that could potentially be released. So there are a number of requirements to meet that exception. There's a question about PIT violations if workers go to a vendor to get their certification. Do you need to, but it doesn't reflect the actual PIT used at the workplace, right? They need to be trained and certified to use the type of powered industrial vehicle that they're going to be operated. There are different types, right? So if you're certified on one type but not another, that would be a citable violation. Similarly, I do think you do need to have some level of site-specific training, right? That is going to it could be essentially a supplement to what they learn, but I certainly think in many instances, you're going to still want to do that hands-on skills evaluation to make sure that they're able to operate the vehicle in your workplace, whether it's narrow aisles or certain clearances and such. You want to make sure that they're aware of those hazards, of their particular unique issues in your workplace. So I will always recommend supplementing any third-party training that is done off-site with some combination of it may be abbreviated, but still classroom training. So again, if you think about it as, what hazards might they be exposed to that are unique to your workplace? And then are they able to operate the vehicle in your workplace, right? If their training was in a big, giant, open parking lot or warehouse with no aisles, no storage racks, et cetera, that is certainly not going to guarantee that they could operate it if you have tight turns or lots of traffic. So just kind of think about it from that perspective. Comment, no requirement in the regs for a pre-shift inspection to be written down. That is correct. But as Dan said, if it's documented, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. You can certainly try to prove it, but I think our view is it's a best practice to have some sort of documentation that it's being done. Obviously, if you're using paper forms, you have there's always the chance that it's pencil whipped and you get if the yes column is, and then the Y and the N, there's just that line down the yes column. So you'd want to be auditing people to make sure that they're actually doing those inspections. You can document the audits, even if you're not documenting the pre-shift inspections. There are a lot of interesting software platforms out there like iWarehouse that, it's an electronic inspection. It changes the order of the questions. It changes what the correct answer is. And then it creates a record that it was done. So it's essentially a passive record keeping. You're not required to do it, but you've got those records available to prove that these inspections are being done. There was a question about homemade attachments on forklifts or pits. Would that include commercially manufactured attachments? Right. I mean, if it's commercially manufactured, presumably at least then you've got specs that could be, used. Maybe there's a data plate, but the key is to, even if it's commercially manufactured, is to verify with the manufacturer or the vendor who provided the vehicle that it's attached to make sure that vehicle can accommodate that. Right. And you should, if it's commercially manufactured, it's likely going to be easier to demonstrate that is appropriate for use on that type of vehicle. Presumably the manufacturer is going to be a lot more likely to say yes. Maybe there's even documentation that already exists to confirm that. Right. But you'll put yourself in the position of the manufacturer of the vehicle or the vendor. They're going to be less likely to approve, and in many cases unwilling to approve shop made attachments. So in that case, you're going to want to go get an engineer who can verify that it is safe to use with that vehicle.
Yeah, and typically when you're buying a commercially manufactured attachment, there's going to be some conversation about what pit it's going to be used on. But doing your due diligence and making sure that information is provided and collecting any updated data plate that is needed, that's going to be on you in OSHA's perspective as well. So having a conversation with that manufacturer is a good idea. Definitely less risky purchasing a commercially manufactured attachment though than the homemade shop ones.
I think, Dan, I see the question about voluntary KN95 use during wildfires. Do we need Appendix D? I think, well, with an N95, I would say absolutely, right? I can't remember. I'm having COVID flashbacks too, because I remember there was some distinctions with the KN95s.
Yeah, it is considered a filtering face piece. I would caution if you are in an area where there's wildfires, and if it's in California, Washington, or Oregon, there's specific wildfire smoke standards that address respiratory protection in detail. So any questions about kind of wildfires, and there's different rules that apply there, certainly as it relates to respiratory protection too, you can follow up with us and we can discuss in more detail.
we hope this is helpful. Get on out there, audit yourself. I know we're all still kind of waiting to see what happens to OSHA in this administration. Real quick, obviously, there are the Secretary of Labor and the Deputy Secretary have been confirmed. We're still waiting on the Assistant Secretary, David Keeling, for OSHA to be. He has not yet had his hearing in the Health Committee in the Senate, so probably be a little while before he's sworn in. But OSHA's still out there. I got pulled into an inspection this morning, a follow-up inspection, multiple inspections, I think probably 5 or 6 just in the last couple of weeks. So they're still out there, they're still inspecting. And even if they're not, right, you want to take care of these things because it keeps your folks safe and healthy. So hope this was helpful to find some of those frequently cited hazards. And again, we're always happy to talk if you want to take deeper dives. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for sticking with us for those of you that did live, and for those of you that are listening on a recording, again, feel free to reach out to us once you listen. Thank you.